Very good to talk to you today. Over the weekend, you were talking about how if it went to full-scale war, Britain as a country may not be prepared to do that. What do you mean by that, sir?
Well, what I mean by that is that we have underfunded our overall defence capability for very many years, really effectively since the end of the Cold War, when the Chancellor and the Prime Minister of the day chose to take a large peace dividend, and that has gone on really every defence review successively to the point that our armed forces are not as capable and as strong as they should be. That's not any criticism to the men and women in uniform or indeed to the military leadership. But frankly, the consequence of underfunding means that we don't have the capability that we would require if we were to get dragged into a major conflict.
And I'm sure during your time serving, Lord Dannatt, you were able to express your view on this. And when you did express your view to the politicians, what was the response? What was the reason given?
Well, you'll have to think back to the days when we were involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9, when I was Chief of the General Staff. I was constantly had my horns locked with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown to argue the case for increased defence funding, and particularly increased funding for the army, our land forces, conducting the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. And frankly, it's a pretty bruising experience, and it's continued. Now, of course, people would say, well, the top generals and admirals and air marshals will always say they want more. And frankly, we do always want more because we want the best for our people. And the best is usually at the cutting edge of technology, which means that it's probably fairly risky and probably fairly expensive. But we want it not for our own vainglorious reasons. We actually want it to make sure that this country is as well prepared as possible for major conflict. And you look around the world today, you look around the situation in the Middle East, look around the situation in Ukraine and Europe. And frankly, of those two, the one that worries me most, continues to worry me most, is frankly what's going on in Ukraine, because this directly affects the security of Europe and directly affects our own security. And there is a very strong case to increase our defence spending, not just to the 2.5% or 3% that's being talked about, but frankly to get back to the kind of levels that we were spending during the Cold War, which was 5% of GDP, if we want to take security of this country seriously.
Well, except that, the dilemma for the government is that if they were to spend 5% of GDP on defence, you could argue it would be at the expense of other public services, whether that's education or health. And, we've got an election this year, and we've also got public services that are frankly struggling in a cost of living crisis. And a lot of people would say it would bankrupt the country to give the kind of defence spending that people like you are calling for.
Well, it wouldn't, is the short answer. But the duty of government is to decide its priorities, to make its allocations for where it wants to put its funding. And there is a very strong case to say, when you look around the world today, that we need to spend some more money, as I said, 2.5%, 3%, maybe up to 5% of GDP on defence. Yes, it would mean another 20 or 30 billion pounds a year. But if you look at, for example, the health and social security budgets, they are enormous. Yes, of course, savings would have to be made somewhere else. But the first duty of government is to provide for the security of the territory of this country and the security of individuals in this country. Yeah. And you can't get away from that responsibility to be placed on government. Well, so we don't like the look of the world at the present moment, but we've got to make sure that we keep our people safe.
Obviously, in your professional opinion, things are bad. But could I ask you, Lord Dannatt, which branches of the armed forces, the services, are worst affected? I mean, if you're to look at the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, is there one of those that is worse affected than the others?
Well, I would make a case for an increase in defence in the round, but what I would point to is the underfunding of our land forces, our army, in recent years. And in a sense, that wouldn't have mattered so much if there was not a very ugly and disastrous land war going on in Europe at the present moment. We have given a tremendous amount of support to Ukraine, but it's left us in a weakened position. Yes, there are some programs for funding later in the decade, but most of those are not out to contract at the present moment, so they are vulnerable to being cut themselves. So to answer your question, it's our land forces that have been most underfunded in recent times. Yet, just look again at the Navy. They're struggling to man some of their ships. They're struggling to produce enough ships. So I'm afraid, whichever way you look at it, our defences are not as strong as they should be, and that's a result of being serially underfunded for decades.
Yeah, and I just wanted to finish by asking, if you look at this escalation we're seeing in the Middle East and the government's resolute refusal to link these Iran-backed Houthi attacks to what's happening in Gaza, do you think actually a better way, perhaps than increasing our spending on defence, would be to acknowledge the role of Gaza in all of this, and perhaps more calls, as some people are saying, for a ceasefire could end a lot of this escalation that we're seeing?
I personally fail to understand why there is no willingness by the government to link the various events going on in the Middle East. As far as I'm concerned, they are all indeed linked, and the common factor is Iran. Frankly, Iran can dial up or dial down this crisis. But I'll just make one final point. Whether we get involved in a greater scale in the Middle East is a matter of discretion. But if Russia was to attack another European country, almost certainly a NATO member, we would be obliged by treaty to get involved. So I worry most about Ukraine and the security of Europe, and I worry less about what is going on in the Middle East, as concerning as that is.